The first part of this session, obviously they're both groundwater related, focusing on what I would consider to be an emerging or kind of newer contaminant, and transitioning here into something that I think has been around a lot longer, but maybe paying increasing attention to, just given kind of the lag time between what might happen on the land surface and what we see in our water resources. Our next speaker is Allison Madison. Allison Madison is the first ever staff person for Wisconsin Saltwise. Since assuming her role in June 2020, she has spearheaded statewide collaboration around salt reduction. Allison has 10 plus years of experience in science and sustainability education in both formal and informal settings, from the Appalachian Mountains to Olympic National Park. Classrooms in inner city Milwaukee to the ponderosa pine forests of Colorado's Front Range. She is a graduate from St. Olaf College and has a joint MS in Environment and Resources in Soil Science from the University of Wisconsin. With that, I'll turn it over to Allison to talk about salt in Wisconsin's waters.
Thanks so much, Kevin, and thank you, Paul, and thanks to everyone who's joining in today. So I'm going to share with you a few screens here, one screen, a few slides. And it looks like I'm sharing. Kevin, can you let me know?
It is. That looks great. Yep.
All right. Thank you so much. So I am going to speak about chloride in our groundwater. We don't really see groundwater. We do see fresh water on the state. We have a lot of it. And I feel very connected to that water. I also feel connected to groundwater because, you know, our bodies, we are made up of water, primarily water by weight. And so whenever I drink water, I remind myself, like, I am drinking Wisconsin water and it's going into my body, and it is literally the blood flowing in my veins is made up of this water. And I can't really get enough of it. I've always loved fresh water. I put up here a couple photos, one from my childhood. I grew up in northwestern Wisconsin, so north of Lake Wissota here in Chippewa County. Spent a lot of time with my family on lakes and rivers in the area. Here I am on Pulaski Lake, which is in Rusk County. And yeah, water has always just meant a lot to me. It's been a place to recreate, to rest. And of course, like I said, we need this water, but in so many ways, we don't really pay attention to how we're treating our water or our land or our bodies, as Paul has described. And one of the things that often goes unseen is the amount of salt that we are putting into our fresh water. So this is a photograph from the Port of Milwaukee, where so much of our salt comes in on barges like the Algoma Sioux. And we just pile up mountains of salt that we then put down on our roadways and parking lots and sidewalks. And once that salt is there and it does its job of decreasing the freezing temperature, freezing point of our snow and ice, it melts that material and it moves with them off our roadways, off those pavements, and it moves into our fresh water, our streams and lakes, wetlands, and our groundwater, which is our drinking water. So we are indeed salting our fresh water. All the salt that we put down on our land is making its way into our water. And we are currently doing that at very high rates. Nationally, we put down around 24 million tons of salt a year. And a lot of that happens in our Midwest snowbelt states. So that salt is beginning to really build up in our surface water and our groundwater. This map was put together by a graduate student at UW-Madison. And to give you a sense of kind of how high concentrations have grown, naturally in Wisconsin, through most of the state, chloride concentrations would be negligible naturally. Really close to zero, definitely under 10 milligrams per liter across the state. So the whole state here should be dark, not light purple. But we see that A lot of our surface water has increased in chloride, most alarmingly those orange and yellow dots, which I will share with you kind of the levels at which salt becomes a toxin. I mean, it's a toxin at any level, but it can become increasingly toxic as it increases in concentration. But it's not just, you know, the fact that we're putting the salt down, we're destroying our planet. We're paying to do that, right? Salt doesn't come from Wisconsin. All the dollars that we spend on salt go out of our state. The DOT right now is paying about $80 a ton for salt. And in total, with all the salt that they pay to put down on our state highways and the salt that they buy and sell to municipalities and counties across the state for municipal county roadways, we spent last winter over $100 million on salt. So we're spending money to, in effect, kind of poison our waters. And there are other costs as well. Salt, we see signs of it, even though we try to, you know, hide these externalities, sometimes they pop out at us. The damage that salt does to the vegetation along roadways, causing around $2 billion of damage a year nationally. Salt leads to the premature aging, corrosion of bridges, damage to roadways. That damage is estimated to be around $5 billion a year. We aren't necessarily actually paying that out a year because we're allowing, in many cases, our infrastructure to become pretty damaged before we pay for those replacements. And then we see the damage done to our personal vehicles. AAA estimates that to be around $3 billion a year. So the true cost of salt is way more than what we're going to pay for it, you know, at the hardware store. You might see that damage happen, you know, to your pavements, like you see on someone's driveway here, or on your floors or your doorways. So for every dollar that you spend on salt, or that we spend on salt collectively, we estimate there's around $10 of damage done by that salt. So of course, we are here to talk about water, and I really just want the biggest point that you to walk away from here is remembering every time you see salt down, where that salt is headed. And hopefully, as we can increase awareness of the impact of that salt, we can create more behavior change. So all of our salt is going into our water. And it's not just road salt. So NaCl, sodium chloride, the most commonly used deicer, it's the cheapest. We see that going down on our roads, but we're also putting it into water softeners. Places across the state where we might soften because water is hard with increased concentrations of calcium and magnesium, or we may soften water because of high concentrations of iron. When we use water softeners that rely on ion exchange, we are in effect putting that sodium and the chloride into our wastewater and then into our fresh water, because wastewater treatment plants can't remove that salt. We also have inputs of chloride from fertilizers. And so all of that makes its way into our water. And because salt water is more dense than fresh water, it sinks down. And that has allowed concentrations to increase without really catching many people's awareness for a number of years. But it can have some pretty pernicious impacts, even at those low levels, or I should say those depths in the water. Salt, as it increases in those lower levels, the water is colder down there, and typically lakes do flip over. Some lakes are going to turn over a couple times a year, and that helps to cycle oxygen and nutrients throughout the water column. But as that salty layer builds up, it can actually deter and inhibit that lake mixing, that natural mixing that's so crucial to our freshwater lakes. And there are actually lakes in New York, thankfully not yet in Wisconsin. Cross your fingers that we won't get to this point. But there are lakes that no longer mix because the salt concentrations have increased so much. Even though you would look at this water, and because salt dissolves in the water, you don't see that. This is a session on chloride in groundwater, and so I would be remiss if I did not show some data that demonstrates the increase of chloride in our groundwater. This data is actually put together by UW-Stevens Point, thanks to Kevin and his team. They've made this publicly available. So you can go online, you can generate a map just like this, and we can see that in large parts of the state, most of the state, especially the southern part of the state, we have increased the chloride concentrations in our groundwater above those natural levels of 0 to 10. We're in the 10 to 50, some areas even 50 to 100. My large map to the right is scaled down to the township level. And then if you zoom into individual counties, you can get down to the section level. And you can see that we have counties, and these are all the data here is from private wells. So these are not urban areas, but they have chloride levels that are 50 to 100, even 100 to 200. And then we have a few that are showing up above 200 milligrams per liter. And as we increase the chloride concentrations in our groundwater, that is also impacting our surface water, because while we see spikes here in a number of Milwaukee rivers and their chloride concentrations, sometimes extremely high spikes, we don't actually see the chloride concentrations get down to 0 anymore. In the summer, as streams are being recharged with groundwater, they're being recharged with slightly salty water. And that's leading to some of these very urban riverways in Wisconsin, in the Milwaukee area, to always kind of hover around this second gray dotted line, which is the chronic threshold for aquatic organisms. So to give you a little bit more information about that, like I said before, naturally chloride concentrations would be under 10. The EPA has set a limit of 230, and the DNR's limit is slightly higher than that. They've said that our aquatic organisms in Wisconsin can tolerate salt concentrations up until 395 milligrams per liter. So this chronic level means that organisms can deal with it kind of on a day-to-day basis. But once they reach or exceed that 395, they can't. And then there's also an acute exposure, which means that even for a very short period of time at concentrations above 757 milligrams per liter, we are causing a lot of stress and harm to aquatic organisms. And to put these numbers in context, since many of us are not chemists and don't necessarily think naturally in milligrams per liter, this 395 milligrams per liter is about 1 teaspoon of salt in 5 gallons of water. So just 1 teaspoon of salt is enough to tip 5 gallons of water above the chronic exposure level for aquatic organisms. And some of the research into how salt is impacting organisms is being done out of the University of Toledo. Bill Hintz spoke during Wisconsin Salt Awareness Week in January. His talk is available on our website and our YouTube channel. And he did some research looking at rainbow trout. And after exposure to salt concentrations that were at and above that acute exposure limit, so limits that we do see or concentrations that we do see out right now, especially near roadways, he documented decreased growth in those rainbow trout. So we do see direct impacts to our aquatic organisms, to fish that a number of us do care about, like to eat with these salt conditions. And additionally, there are indirect impacts. So fish aren't necessarily the first species to be impacted by salt. That would actually be our zooplankton, a little less charismatic fauna. But as zooplankton concentrations go down when salt's going up, the zooplankton are not available as a food source to fish, and that's causing a decrease in planktivorous fish concentrations. And as there's less fish available, that kind of makes its way up the food chain. There are less piscivorous fish that we like to really catch. You can look kind of down the food chain as well. So as zooplankton concentrations go down, we see an increase in algae. And that's because zooplankton eat that algae. There aren't as many of them. There's more algae and our water gets greener and murkier. So a number of organizations in the Madison area have become increasingly concerned with the salt concentrations in our surface water, in our groundwater. And so about 5 years ago, they came together to form Wisconsin Saltwise to help reduce the salt pollution. They were looking at concentrations of salt in the Yahara lakes on a steady increase. They were also looking at the concentrations of salt in our aquifers. So well 14 here, if you're familiar with Madison, this is right on University Avenue and Whitney Way, is this top whisker in the plot. Concentrations at well 14 are such that some residents say they can taste the salt already. It technically has not reached the EPA taste threshold value, but it is predicted to do so in around 10 years. And once our groundwater is salty, once our drinking water is salty, we are really stuck. It is millions of dollars to put in a new well, but this just moving the well while we're continue to salt the landscape is not a long-term solution. So Wisconsin Saltwise has been working in Dane County, and last year when I started with Saltwise, I began reaching out to other organizations across the state that have been doing work in salt reduction, salt awareness. So reaching out to the organizations that you see here, and then I wrote a grant to the Fund for Lake Michigan, and they generously were willing to fund our work. And so what I'm doing right now is trying to take Wisconsin Saltwise statewide with the support of all of the past and current partners. So on our website, we've got a lot of resources available for everyone from the common citizen, municipalities who take care of their roads, road maintenance, private companies as well. And one of the big pushes for Wisconsin Saltwise has been to educate those who do winter maintenance professionally. So we've been trying to get the word out about free classes. We've been able to offer smart salting classes for free, focused both on roads as well as people who do parking lots and sidewalks. And we've got one more coming up in March, this Friday. If you have anybody in mind, feel free to help send the word out about that. They've been really, really successful. So the Village of DeForest here, I've got a quote from the Public Service Projects Coordinator, where he mentions the importance of calibration, pre-treatment of roads, the Saltwise class, the need to kind of budget, get officials, I'd say really everybody on board, but that's helped them reduce their salt use by 200 tons a year. Now remember, 1 teaspoon of salt is enough to protect 5 gallons of water. Just imagine how much reducing our salt use by 200 tons would be, and that's just in one community. So to zoom in on some of those best management practices, Cudahy, just south of Milwaukee, has achieved 70% reductions in salt use through those same big things: training, equipment calibration, and incorporation of brine. Just calibration alone. So before even changing up their practices, just calibrating their equipment so they know how much salt is going down and they can apply to their ideal rates, allow them to reduce salt use by 50%, 50%. So of course, calibration is one of the biggest things that we push people to do with whatever equipment they may have. In addition to just working with the equipment you have, though, there have been really major reductions through the incorporation of liquid materials. So salt brine is just 23.3% salt to water. It is still salt, but by putting salt brine down before the storm, it works like putting oil down on your skillet before you put your food down. So if you forget that oil, you're scraping and you're scraping and you're scraping. But if you put that oil down, just like the brine down before the storm, it can prevent the bond between the snow and the pavement from forming. And then when companies come through their plows, that snow picks right up, and you don't need to go over it as many times. The brine just activates things and allows that mechanical removal to go much more quickly. So the Bruce Company, a private company in Middleton, Wisconsin, has achieved over 50% reductions through the incorporation of brine, of course, also that training, class, calibration. So we do like to say, love the lines, those lines that you sometimes see on county roads. The DOT is really pushing the use of brine. They've seen, again, reductions from 50 to 70%. That brine can really help a long way in salt reduction. Also, we can make more investments, capital investments in our equipment. So the city of Middleton, just outside of Madison, has reduced salt use by 50%. And a good part of that was achieved by upgrading their systems to be closed loop, to be really, I'd say, like the smart trucks. So they don't put salt down when the trucks are stopped. And instead of just having a 1, 2, 3, they can actually program the truck to put down salt according to a specific number of pounds per lane mile. And so when the truck's moving faster, it's putting out a little more salt. As it slows down, the auger automatically slows down. And so that's allowed them to really reduce salt use while still maintaining a high level, a high quality of service. And the town of Lynn here, I love this. This is a little town outside of Lake Geneva, and they got into brine, and they had a very innovative highway superintendent here, Matt Whittam. And I love his photo because it shows us that we don't need to have necessarily huge capital investments to begin to make these reductions. Just go down to Mills Fleet Farm, use your backyard mechanic skills, and you can help protect our fresh water. Matt does, though, bring up one key piece, is kind of battling that this is the way we've always done it mentality. So we might see that from citizens, from plow drivers, from elected officials. We need to get people to be thinking outside the box about how we have to do winter maintenance and what it's going to look like. So that's what Saltwise is really trying to do. It's trying to help people to think about winter maintenance differently, think about salt differently. So we try to get as much positive press out there as we can for communities like the city of Wausau that have really reduced salt use. We also get the word out about common citizens who go around and maybe notice a salt spill, and instead of just shaking their heads at it or blaming the person who maybe had an accident, we know this happens sometimes, people who get out there and sweep up some salt. It's not just winter road salt, so I wanted to throw a couple slides in here before I finish up about water softener salt. So all the salt we put in the softeners goes to the wastewater treatment plants, and because they cannot remove it, it then goes into our fresh water. And all of these orange dots are wastewater treatment plants who are currently discharging salt above the rates that the DNR has advised. But the DNR has granted them variances to do so because, as Paul mentioned with PFAS, it's not the wastewater treatment plants who are generating this chemical. It's not the wastewater treatment plants who are generating the salt. It's coming to them from our homes, from industry, and they kind of have their hands tied, right? Salt cannot easily be removed from water. Doing so would require astronomical amounts of energy, which again would have huge financial implications. The city of Madison ran the numbers, and trying to take salt out of all of our wastewater would increase rates by 500%. So we see all of these wastewater treatment plants in areas where the groundwater is really hard and people are softening water. That salt comes to the wastewater treatment plants and they're just discharging it. So I would ask that each of you as individuals, as community members, works to be a Saltwise champion and helps to get the word out to your communities, to your networks, that there is a different way to do this, but we need to start to think about salt. We need to be Saltwise. So at home, getting out there with a shovel and getting up as much snow as you can. Scatter salt. So I've got my little cup here, Saltwise cup. It's probably way too small for you to see, but just one little cup of salt is enough for a 20-foot driveway or 10 sidewalk squares. We tend to really over apply salt, and we want people to start to salt differently. Switch over to sand. When it's below 15 degrees, salt doesn't work anyway, so don't use it. If you've applied too much, or maybe you see your neighbor has, help and get out there and sweep up that salt. And then if you live or have a water softener at home, assess it and see, can it be optimized? Do you have a really old clunker that should be removed for a more efficient model? Remembering that all that salt goes into our water. Saltwise also does a number of public outreach events. Of course, it's been a little limited during COVID, but I'm hoping this summer to get out around the state. If you would be interested as a municipality, or if you have connections with different youth organizations or any watershed groups, I'd be happy to come and lead an outreach event and get people out on the water, do some chloride monitoring and see where the baseline levels are, and then maybe get people inspired to monitor chloride throughout the year. And then finally, going back to the foundation of this program, that education for professionals. So we do have a number of 4-hour trainings, and our last one this spring is coming up on Friday. You can sign up for that online, and then we will have some more this coming fall. So with that, I will turn it back over to Kevin if anyone has questions.
Thanks, Allison. And we do have a number of questions that have been coming in. I apologize to anybody that asked questions for Paul. I did not have my Q&A being updated. So there are a few questions at the end that we might have and be able to get back to for Paul as well. But for you, Allison, specifically, I've been to the Wisconsin Saltwise website. It's a great resource. I think I've been impressed by the amount of information, but also, some of the case studies showing what various municipalities are doing to try and address this issue. One of the questions, though, was how do you go about understanding whether your state's DOT or maybe your local municipality is employing best management practices when it comes to salt use?
So I would say that the DOT is working really hard to promote best management practices. The DOT does outreach to all of the counties, and then the DOT analyzes, how much salt is being put down by each county. So I would say, that if you live in Wisconsin, the DOT is working hard on this issue. You can get information from them about your county, and then about your municipality. I would say you might need to reach out, have a conversation with someone in the Department of Public Works. And if you find out that they aren't thinking about salt, then I would encourage you to send them our way. Like I said, these classes are free. We're happy to work with them and help network them with other communities that are leaders in this.
Another question here, for the average homeowner, are there any effective environmentally friendly salt alternatives that one may use at their home in the winter months?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, the only environmentally friendly deicers are the ones you don't use. There is no truth in labeling for deicers. And so they can say environmentally friendly, they can say pet friendly, they can say melt down to, negative 20 degrees. Doesn't mean that it's true. And the vast majority of our deicers have chloride in them, either sodium chloride, calcium chloride, magnesium chloride. Those last two do melt snow and ice at lower temperatures, but they still have those chlorides that are permanent pollutants in our water. And really, anything that you put down that's, causing that ice to melt, think of that as something persistent in our ecosystem. I could get into all of them, but I would say go to the website if you want to learn a little bit more, but there is unfortunately no silver bullet. Besides, a lot of elbow grease, trying to get out there with your shovel early, often before there's compaction. Also, I would say this time of year, if you see a trouble spot, like maybe there's a gutter that is draining out across your sidewalk, like think about this summer, how you can then kind of work to fix that problem so you don't have that cropping up again next year.
Another question here about, climate change and what moving forward, what challenges might exist to communities, challenges or maybe opportunities for salt moving forward regarding climate change.
Yeah, and I would say that's, pretty variable across the state, even what we're, expecting to see with climate change. think everyone was pretty surprised this winter in southern Wisconsin. We had incredible snow. And then, you go up to central and northern Wisconsin and people are saying, we didn't have much to deal with this winter. But I do think that we are projected to see more kind of freeze-thaw cycles, which can create more issues for those, both private and public winter maintenance operators in terms of, trying to predict the individual storm. And they spend a lot of time, on the weather stations trying to look at what the storm is that's coming towards them and how can they employ the right, winter maintenance kind of materials and also just like techniques. So I think in general, it's just being more wise about salt. So, is it a good time to use that rock salt? Is it a good time to put down brine? Is it good to go with like a pre-wet? Or should you be incorporating some calcium and magnesium chloride in with the brine? And so just having more tools in your toolbox is going to help people be able to tackle whatever, weather is thrown at them.
Thanks. There's a couple of questions here for Paul relating to the previous presentation on PFAS that I'd like to get to, and maybe go a few minutes after just to account for some of these questions that came in. Paul, one of the questions here is, are there states recognized as leaders when it comes to addressing PFAS contamination in both surface and groundwater?
Yeah, I mean, so there are some states that are ahead of Wisconsin. To Wisconsin's credit, I would say that we've made some very big strides in the past couple of years, and the current administration is doing a great job on it. But as I mentioned in my presentation, Michigan, they've been on top. They've been on this, and I know Wisconsin's been kind of looking to them to see what they've been doing. I'd say Michigan, Vermont, New Hampshire I think are the main ones ahead of us right now. Minnesota is a little bit ahead. I don't know if they have groundwater standards in Minnesota. But Michigan, New Hampshire, Vermont are the ones.
Another question that I think a lot of people have voted up here is questions about the various suits that entities may have been bringing to the state of Wisconsin regarding kind of their cleanup requirements and what the status of those might be, or maybe some background on the cleanup requirements and legally where the state might be at with those.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have much of background on that, so I apologize. I don't know that.
So we'll have to defer those questions. One last question for you, Paul. Does Wisconsin have an agency comparable to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency? So each state is a little bit different in terms of what we name our agencies. Who would be the comparable entity to pollution control in Wisconsin here?
Yeah, with respect to PFAS, the DNR is the comparable one. But like I said, the Wisconsin PFAS action plan, that was, they brought together all the agencies to get input, and so that all the agencies could know what kind of role they play in it. But in terms of the equivalency with respect to PFAS, it would be the DNR here. But the action plan was a collection of all the agencies getting together to know their role in it.
Great, thanks. And with that, we're approaching the end of this particular session. I'd like to thank our session sponsor, Extension Lakes. I'd also like to highlight, for those of you joining for Wisconsin Water Week, we do have a short break. We will resume at 11 o'clock with our morning plenary speaker, Catherine Hayhoe, who will be talking about climate and why facts aren't enough. So for those of you who may be joining us for Wisconsin Water Week, feel free to take some time to tour the exhibits of our sponsors, and we will look forward to seeing you again at 11 o'clock for our morning plenary. With that, I'd like to thank Paul and Allison for your time and being able to share your expertise with us today. Thanks everybody who might be joining us from Wisconsin Eye as well. With that, have a great morning.